The moment that changed everything wasn't in a courtroom or a therapist's office. It was on a summer evening, sitting outside a local ice cream shop. I was enjoying a quiet moment with my daughter when a flash of red and chrome caught my eye, a motorcycle roaring by carrying two riders. The woman on the back wore a familiar white t-shirt with a red cross, red sneakers, and an unmistakable laugh that hit me like a punch to the gut. It was my wife. That's when I knew my life was about to change forever. It was well past 11 p.m. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new one. Sometimes the most significant connections begin in the smallest of places. I first saw Sarah in the library of our community college during a quiet summer session. The place smelled of old books and desperation, filled with students cramming for finals. Sarah, however, stood out. She sat at a corner table, her head buried in a thick law textbook, her pen tapping in rhythmic concentration. I don't know if it was her intensity, or the way she occasionally pushed her hair behind her ear, lost in thought, but I was drawn to her immediately. It took me days to muster the courage to speak to her. "That looks exhausting," I said, nodding toward her pile of books. She looked up, startled, then smiled, warm, genuine, the kind of smile that made you feel seen. "Only if you don't love what you're learning," she replied, her tone a mix of earnestness and wit. That was Sarah, serious about her goals, but always open to connection. We started meeting regularly, talking about everything from politics to philosophy. Sarah's curiosity was infectious. She could dissect the nuances of a legal argument and then turn around to discuss the poetry of life with equal fervor. In contrast, I was more grounded, focused on the practicalities of engineering and construction. "You think in straight lines," she once teased, while I liked to dance in circles. By the time we transferred to California State University, it felt inevitable that we'd become a couple. Despite our different aspirations, her dreams of law and my plans to break away from my father's shadow, there was an unspoken belief that we could navigate life together. But Sarah's father was less certain. When we announced our engagement, he pulled me aside. "You're ambitious, I'll give you that," he said, his voice low and firm. "But ambition isn't enough. I want Sarah protected. A prenuptial agreement is non-negotiable." The terms were cold and clear: separate assets, no alimony, and no shared debts. It stung, but I understood his reasoning. For Sarah, I agreed, though not without adding my own clause. Fairness for both of us. "I trust you," Sarah said later, her hand in mine. "This is just something to ease his mind." We married shortly after graduation, believing love was enough to overcome any obstacle. But in hindsight, that agreement was more than just a legal safeguard. It was the first sign of the divide between us, a subtle but growing tension that would later erupt in ways we never anticipated. When Sarah and I said our vows, we knew marriage wouldn't be easy. We were young, ambitious, and brimming with hope. What we didn't fully grasp was just how much life would test us, pushing our limits in ways neither of us had anticipated. Sarah started law school that fall, and the financial burden hit us immediately. Her modest scholarship barely made a dent in the tuition fees, and the rest had to come from loans. The numbers were staggering, more than I had ever seen in my life. Every semester, the debts mounted higher, like a shadow growing longer with each passing day. Meanwhile, I had taken a job with a local contractor, working long hours to keep us afloat. The pay was steady but unremarkable, and the physical labor was grueling. Still, I didn't mind. I was building something. Our future, and that thought kept me going. Our apartment in Lakeview was tiny but functional. It had one bedroom, a cramped kitchen, and a living room that doubled as Sarah's study space. We couldn't afford luxuries, but we made the most of what we had. On weekends, we'd cook simple meals together, finding joy in the little things. She'd quiz me on legal jargon while I patched up our squeaky faucets. It was far from glamorous, but it was ours. However, the stress of balancing work, bills, and Sarah's law school demands began to take its toll. Sarah's workload was relentless. Case studies, mock trials, endless hours of reading. She started staying up late, her desk littered with coffee cups and highlighted textbooks. I'd often fall asleep on the couch, waiting for her to finish, only to wake up hours later and carry her to bed. "Are we ever going to have a normal life?" I asked one night, half joking as I tucked a blanket over her. She looked at me with tired eyes and a small smile. "This is normal, for now. Just wait. Once I graduate, it'll all pay off." I wanted to believe her, but the constant grind made it hard. The weight of being the primary breadwinner while watching her accumulate debt was crushing, and though I never said it out loud, I sometimes wondered if we'd bitten off more than we could chew. Despite the mounting pressure, there were bright moments that reminded us why we had chosen this life together. One of those moments came when Sarah carefully planned her pregnancy to align with her post-graduation timeline. She was meticulous, as always, researching every detail to ensure her career wouldn't be derailed. When she told me she was pregnant, we were sitting on the worn-out couch in our living room. She handed me a small box with a pair of baby socks inside. For a moment, I was speechless. "You're serious?" I asked, my voice a mix of disbelief and excitement. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "We're going to be parents." The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. We converted our tiny office nook into a makeshift nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and assembling a crib we'd found on clearance. Sarah was glowing despite the stress, and for a while it felt like we were invincible. When Sophie was born, the world seemed to stop. Holding her for the first time, I was overwhelmed by a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. She was perfect. Tiny fingers, soft tufts of hair, and the most curious little eyes. All the exhaustion and worry melted away in that moment. But as any parent knows, joy and exhaustion often come hand in hand. The first few months with Sophie were a blur of sleepless nights and diaper changes. Sarah returned to law school shortly after giving birth, leaving me to juggle work and childcare. I'd drop Sophie off at daycare in the morning, rush to job sites during the day, and pick her up in the afternoon before starting dinner. Sarah, meanwhile, was running on fumes. Between late nights at the library and early mornings with Sophie, she was stretched thin. I could see the guilt in her eyes every time she handed Sophie over to me or the daycare staff, but there was little we could do. Her internship at a high-pressure law firm only added to the strain. One evening, after Sophie had finally fallen asleep, I found Sarah sitting on the floor of the nursery, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" I asked, kneeling beside her. "I feel like I'm failing," she whispered, "at everything, as a mom, as a student, as a wife." I pulled her into a hug, my own exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "You're not failing. You're doing the best you can. We both are." It was a rare moment of vulnerability for her, and it reminded me of the woman I had fallen in love with. The one who believed in fairness and fought for what mattered. Despite these moments of connection, cracks were beginning to show. Sarah's career ambitions consumed her, while I found myself slipping into the role of primary caregiver without much discussion. I didn't resent Sophie, but I resented how much of the parenting burden seemed to fall on me by default. As Sophie grew, she became the glue holding us together. Her laughter filled the apartment, her tiny milestones giving us reasons to celebrate even on the hardest days. The first time she said "Mama," Sarah cried, holding her close as if to make up for all the time she'd spent away. But even Sophie's warmth couldn't fully bridge the growing gap between us. Sarah's late nights became more frequent, her phone constantly buzzing with emails and calls. I started to feel like a spectator in her life, watching as her career pulled her further away. Still, I held on to hope. I told myself that once she graduated and passed the bar exam, things would get easier. We'd have more time for each other, more stability for Sophie. But deep down, I knew that something fundamental had shifted. We were no longer partners in the same sense. We were two people moving in parallel, connected only by the life we had built around us. And as much as I wanted to believe in the future we had planned, the weight of unspoken expectations and growing financial strain loomed over us. Sophie was our anchor, but even anchors can't hold forever against a strong enough tide. As Sarah's career took off and I ventured into building my own business, the pressures of life only grew. We were chasing dreams on separate tracks, and it was only a matter of time before the cracks in our marriage became impossible to ignore. The first signs of imbalance in our marriage were subtle, like a slow leak in a ship. Sarah's career at the law firm was taking off, and with it came longer hours, greater stress, and an intensity I hadn't fully anticipated. At first, I tried to be understanding, chalking it up to the sacrifices necessary for success. But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that her work wasn't just a demanding job, it was her entire world. I found myself stepping further into the role of primary caregiver for Sophie. My mornings began with packing her lunch, dropping her at daycare, and heading to work. My afternoons ended with picking her up, preparing dinner, and supervising bedtime. Sarah often didn't come home until well after Sophie was asleep, her energy spent on clients and cases. One evening, as I was tucking Sophie into bed, she asked, "When's Mommy coming home?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "She's working late, sweetheart. She'll see you in the morning." But Sophie's furrowed brow told me she wasn't satisfied. She works a lot. Later that night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where Sarah should have been. A mix of resentment and loneliness swirled in my chest. I wasn't angry at her ambition. I admired it in a way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being left behind, a supporting character in her story. When Sarah finally came home, her face was pale and drawn, her bag heavy with case files. "Long day?" I asked, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "You have no idea," she replied, collapsing onto the couch. "I have a deposition tomorrow and the prep is killing me." I wanted to tell her about Sophie's day or how I'd fixed the broken sink in the bathroom, but her attention was already on her phone. A part of me wanted to demand that she unplug to remind her that we were here too. But I didn't. Instead, I swallowed my frustration and cleared her untouched dinner plate from the table. The cracks widened when Sarah decided it was time for us to buy a house. Our apartment, while small, was manageable, and I saw no reason to rush into something bigger. But Sarah had other ideas. "We can't keep living like this," she argued one Saturday morning, waving a glossy real estate brochure in my face. "Sophie needs her own room. We need space." I looked at the listing, a sprawling new build in a cookie-cutter neighborhood, complete with a 2-car garage and a mortgage that made my stomach churn. It's a lot," I said carefully. "Are you sure this is the right time?" Sarah frowned, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "When will it ever be the right time? I'm working my ass off, and I want something to show for it." Her words stung, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the implication that my contributions were less significant. Maybe it was the realization that we had very different ideas of what success looked like. "We can't afford this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Between your loans and our expenses, this house would stretch us too thin." Sarah crossed her arms, her tone sharpening. "You always act like money is the only thing that matters. What about quality of life? What about giving Sophie a nice home to grow up in? And what happens when we can't make the payments, when we're drowning in debt?" I shot back, my frustration finally boiling over. "I'm trying to be realistic, Sarah, that's all." The argument ended with Sarah storming out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I knew she wasn't entirely wrong. Our apartment was cramped, and Sophie deserved better. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this house wasn't about Sophie, or even us. It was about Sarah proving something, to herself, or maybe to the world. In the end, I relented. Sarah's enthusiasm was impossible to resist, and part of me wanted to believe that this house would solve some of our problems. We settled on a new construction in an upscale suburb, with Sarah's father generously contributing to the down payment. The mortgage was steep, more than I'd ever paid for anything, but Sarah assured me it was worth it. "This is our future," she said as we stood in the empty living room, the scent of fresh paint still hanging in the air. "You'll see." At first, it did feel like a fresh start. The space was luxurious compared to our apartment, and Sophie loved running through the backyard, her laughter echoing off the walls. But the financial strain quickly became apparent. Between the mortgage, utilities, and upkeep, our monthly expenses skyrocketed. Sarah's student loans alone were a second mortgage, and every time I suggested cutting back, she brushed me off. "We'll manage," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm up for a promotion soon. Things will get better." I wanted to believe her, but the numbers told a different story. My contracting business was steady, but it wasn't enough to keep us afloat without dipping into savings. I started working longer hours, taking on extra projects to make up the difference. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was building other people's dream homes while struggling to keep our own. As the months passed, the house became less of a home and more of a battleground. Sarah and I argued more frequently, often late at night, when the exhaustion made us sharp-tongued and impatient. "Do you even want this life?" she snapped during one particularly heated exchange, "because it feels like you're always looking for reasons to say no." "I want a life we can actually afford," I shot back. "One where we're not drowning in bills just to keep up appearances." A word from her and I'd be settled for life. Her eyes flashed with anger. "This isn't just about money. It's about giving Sophie something better." "And what good is that if we're miserable in the process?" The conversation ended like so many others, with silence, each of us retreating to our corners, nursing our wounds. Sophie, blissfully unaware of the tension, remained our one source of light. Her laughter filled the house, her small victories, learning to ride a bike, bringing home her first school art project, gave us moments of shared pride. But even she couldn't bridge the growing divide between us. Looking back, the house was more than just a financial strain. It was a symbol of how far apart we drifted. Sarah saw it as a milestone, proof that her sacrifices were paying off. I saw it as a burden, a constant reminder of how much we were risking. We were like two people rowing in opposite directions, each convinced they knew the way to safety. And while we loved Sophie deeply, even she couldn't anchor us in the storm that was brewing. As Sarah's career demands continued to escalate and my frustrations grew harder to contain, the cracks in our marriage became impossible to ignore. The house, once a symbol of hope, now stood as a monument to our differing priorities. It was only a matter of time before the inevitable collapse. The cracks in our marriage, once subtle and ignorable, had grown into chasms I could no longer cross. Sarah's hours at the firm had always been long, but in the past few months, her absences had started to feel different. It wasn't just the time she spent away, it was the secrecy, the unexplained messages, and the evasiveness when I asked simple questions. It began with her phone, always buzzing with texts and emails late into the night. At first, I chalked it up to her demanding job, but then she started taking her phone with her everywhere, even into the bathroom. She became defensive. When I asked who was calling or why she was always on call, despite her corporate role. One evening, as we sat on the couch, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it quickly, then flicked it over. "Who's that?" I asked casually, trying not to sound accusatory. "Just work," she replied, her tone clipped. I nodded, but something felt off. "Work always seems to need you at the strangest hours." She didn't respond, instead pretending to be engrossed in the television. The silence between us was heavy, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of distrust. It was a small thing, but small things have a way of growing into monsters when left unchecked. As weeks went by, her behavior became increasingly erratic. She'd leave the house dressed casually, but return hours later in freshly ironed clothes. She stopped inviting me to her firm's social events, claiming they were just work stuff and that I wouldn't enjoy them. When I pressed, she became defensive, accusing me of being paranoid. "I don't have time for this, Michael," she snapped one night after I questioned her sudden weekend plans. "You don't trust me? Fine, but I'm not going to justify every minute of my day to you." Her words stung, but they didn't ease my doubts. In fact, they only made me more suspicious. I started noticing inconsistencies in her stories. Meetings that didn't match her firm's schedule. Late-night errands that didn't make sense. My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Then came the breaking point. One Friday evening, after a long day at work, I found a receipt tucked into the passenger seat of her car. It was for dinner at a high-end restaurant across town, dated the night before. She had told me she was working late. I knew I couldn't confront her without proof. Part of me still wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but another part of me was bracing for the worst. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. Sam Fisher came recommended by a colleague. He was a no-nonsense type, middle-aged with a sharp eye and a knack for reading people. When I met him at a local diner to discuss the situation, he listened quietly, jotting down notes as I spoke. "So, you think she's cheating?" he asked bluntly, setting his pen down. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice low. "But something's not right. I need to know the truth. For me? For Sophie?" Sam nodded. "I'll start with the basics. Taylor, check her phone records, see who she's meeting. If there's something going on, I'll find it." She nodded. "I'll do that." Sam headed for the door. "Sam, I wish you'd go to the doctor." The following days were agonizing. Every time Sarah left the house, I wondered where she was going, who she was meeting. I became hyper-aware of every detail. Her hurried goodbyes, her vague explanations, the way she avoided eye contact when I asked about her day. I felt like I was living in a fog, waiting for it to lift, but dreading what I might see when it did. A week later, Sam called me with an update. His voice was calm, almost clinical, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. She's been meeting a man, Kane, a colleague from her firm. They've been to a motel twice this week. I felt my stomach drop. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Positive. I have photos, timestamps, everything. I can send you the files if you'd like." "No," I said quickly, the thought of seeing them together too much to bear. "Not yet." Sam hesitated. "I'm sorry, Michael. I know this isn't easy." I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. The room felt impossibly small, the walls closing in around me. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at nothing, trying to process what I'd just learned. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to confront Sarah and demand an explanation. But above all, I felt a deep, aching sense of loss, not just for my marriage, but for the life I thought we had built together. That night, I barely slept. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, going over everything in my head. I thought about the years we had spent together, the sacrifices I had made, the promises we had exchanged, and I thought about Sophie, who had no idea that her parents' marriage was falling apart. By morning, my anger had crystallized into resolve. If Sarah had chosen to betray our family, then I needed to protect what was left. I called Sam and asked him to gather more evidence, not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed leverage. The prenuptial agreement, ironclad as it was, didn't cover custody. I wasn't about to let her take Sophie from me. I also met with a lawyer to discuss my options. He was sympathetic but straightforward, explaining the legal process and what I could expect. "The prenup will protect your assets," he assured me. "But custody could get tricky. Documentation will help." Over the next few days, I quietly began putting my plan into action. I opened a separate bank account, rerouted my paychecks, and started gathering important documents. I timed bill payments so that Sarah wouldn't notice anything was amiss. I also made arrangements to move out, scouting apartments and discreetly packing my belongings. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal, sitting across from Sarah at the dinner table while knowing what I knew. The final straw came one evening when Sarah left for yet another work meeting. As she walked out the door, I caught a whiff of her perfume, one she only wore on special occasions. It was a small detail, but it solidified everything for me. There was no going back. I watched her drive away, my heart pounding with a mix of rage and sadness. For years, I had built my life around her, supporting her dreams, raising our daughter, sacrificing my own ambitions for the sake of our family. And now, it felt like all of it had been for nothing. As Sarah's betrayal came into sharp focus, I knew that confrontation was inevitable. But I also knew that I needed to approach it carefully, for Sophie's sake and for my own. The time for denial was over. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. When I handed Sarah the divorce papers, the room was filled with a silence so heavy it seemed to press against my chest. She stood by the kitchen counter, staring at the stack of documents in her hands. For a moment, I thought she might say something, an apology, a defense, even anger. But all she did was set the papers down, her expression unreadable. The divorce proceedings began swiftly. The prenuptial agreement, drafted so carefully by her father, turned out to be my lifeline. It was airtight, protecting my assets and business from her claims. My lawyer was firm but fair, ensuring the process moved as efficiently as possible. "You've been smart about this," my lawyer told me during one of our meetings. "The prenup does most of the heavy lifting, but we need to focus on custody. That's where things could get messy." Custody was my non-negotiable. I had raised Sophie, been her constant, and I wasn't about to let Sarah's choices disrupt her stability. Sarah's lawyer tried to argue for shared custody, citing her new commitment to being more present, but the evidence I'd gathered told a different story. My lawyer presented the investigator's photos, timestamps, and records, painting a clear picture of Sarah's priorities over the past months. The judge's decision was decisive. I was awarded primary custody, with Sarah granted visitation rights. When the ruling came down, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow, not for myself, but for Sophie, who would grow up navigating a fractured family. While the divorce proceedings moved forward, Sarah's life began to crumble in ways I hadn't anticipated. News of her affair with Cain spread like wildfire through her firm, exacerbated by revelations of Cain's other indiscretions. It turned out that Sarah wasn't the only one he had been meeting at that motel. Several colleagues and even clients came forward, each scandal further tarnishing Cain's and, by association, Sarah's reputations. Sarah was called into a meeting with the firm's partners, who made it clear that her position was no longer tenable. Though they couched it as a mutual decision, it was obvious she had been forced out. Losing her job was a blow she hadn't seen coming, and her financial stability, already precarious, was now in free fall. One evening, she called me, her voice trembling with frustration and despair. "You got what you wanted," she said bitterly. "The house is gone, my job is gone, and Sophie's with you. Are you happy now?" I sighed, gripping the phone tightly. "This was never about taking anything from you, Sarah. You made choices, and now you're facing the consequences. I didn't create this mess. You did." Her silence on the other end spoke volumes, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of pity. But it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the memory of her betrayal. Curious, the embody's gaze sought truth in mine. It should stand clear. The resignation had faded. In the weeks following the divorce, I threw myself into work. The renovation project on the 1920s mansion became my refuge, a place where I could channel my anger and hurt into something productive. With every nail hammered and every wall restored, I felt a piece of myself coming back together. Late at night, though, the weight of it all would hit me. I'd sit in the quiet of my new home, a small but charming gatehouse I'd purchased, and replay the events that had led to this point. How had we gone from young and hopeful to this fractured mess? At first, my thoughts were consumed by anger. I replayed every lie, every excuse, every moment when she could have chosen differently, but didn't. But as time went on, the anger began to fade, replaced by a quieter, deeper sadness. I realized that I wasn't just mourning the betrayal. I was mourning the life we had planned, the version of us that never came to be. One night, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she looked up at me with wide, curious eyes. "Daddy, are you sad?" she asked. I hesitated, caught off guard by her perceptiveness. "A little," I admitted, "but I'm happy too, because I have you." She smiled, her small hand reaching up to pat my cheek. "Don't be sad. We're a team." Her words stayed with me long after she had fallen asleep. In that moment, I realized that Sophie wasn't just my responsibility. She was my anchor, the reason I kept moving forward. As the dust settled, I began to reflect on what the entire ordeal had taught me. Betrayal, I realized, had a way of clarifying things. It stripped away illusions and forced me to confront truths I had long ignored. I had spent so much of my marriage trying to be the steady one, the fixer, the problem solver, that I had lost sight of my own needs. Sarah's choices may have shattered our family, but they also pushed me to rebuild on a foundation that was truly mine. I started taking small steps to reclaim my life. I reconnected with old friends, something I hadn't had time for during the chaos of my marriage. I began attending Sophie's school events and soccer games, finding joy in her accomplishments and the small moments we shared. Work, too, became a source of pride rather than just a means to an end. The historical restoration projects I had once taken on reluctantly now felt like a calling. Each completed project was a testament to resilience and craftsmanship, qualities I was beginning to see in myself. Sarah's life, meanwhile, continued to unravel. The house was foreclosed and she moved into a modest apartment. Her attempts to rebuild her career were met with resistance, the scandal casting a long shadow over her reputation. She reached out a few times, asking for help or even reconciliation, but I made it clear that there was no going back. "Michael," she said during one particularly emotional phone call, "I was wrong. I know that now. Can't we just try again for Sophie's sake?" I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "For Sophie's sake, we need to be civil, but that's where it ends, Sarah. We're done." She didn't argue, and for once, I felt no guilt in holding my ground. The divorce was final, and though the scars remained, I felt lighter, freer. The betrayal that had once threatened to consume me had become a catalyst for growth. Sophie and I were building a new life together, one filled with stability, love, and the promise of better days ahead. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that the best chapters of my story were still waiting to be written. Rebuilding my life wasn't a single transformative moment. It was a series of small, deliberate steps forward. After the divorce, the weight of anger and betrayal slowly gave way to a quiet determination. I wasn't just moving on for myself. I was building something better for Sophie, who deserved stability, love, and a father who wouldn't let her down. The first major decision I made was to sell my contracting business. It had been my lifeline during the marriage. But the stress of managing large-scale projects no longer aligned with the life I wanted. With a hefty profit from the sale, I pivoted toward a niche that had always fascinated me: historical restoration. Working with old structures gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. There was something deeply satisfying about breathing new life into forgotten buildings, preserving the craftsmanship of another era. It was meticulous work, requiring patience and attention to detail, traits I had developed in both my personal and professional life. One of my first projects was restoring a dilapidated Victorian house in a nearby town. It was a challenging job, but every beam I sanded, every ornate detail I repaired, felt like a metaphor for my own rebuilding. By the time the project was finished, I had gained a reputation for quality work. New clients began reaching out, and soon I had a steady stream of projects that not only paid the bills, but also brought me genuine fulfillment. At the heart of everything I did was Sophie. She was no longer just a child I was raising. She was my partner in this new chapter. Our bond deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated, and the time we spent together became the highlight of my days. Mornings started with shared routines, making breakfast, discussing her latest school projects, and racing to the car to avoid being late. Afternoons were filled with laughter as we worked on art projects, built pillow forts, or practiced her soccer drills in the backyard. I made it a point to be present for every milestone, from her first school play to her victories on the soccer field. One evening, as we were painting a birdhouse together, Sophie looked up at me, her face streaked with blue paint. "You're the best dad ever," she said matter-of-factly. I laughed, ruffling her hair. "Why's that?" "Because you're always here," she said simply, "and you make everything fun." Paul said. Her words stayed with me long after she had gone to bed. In that moment I realized that despite the upheaval, we were creating a life filled with love and security. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. The victories in my new life weren't grand or flashy. They were small, meaningful moments that added up over time. The first time I walked Sophie to school without worrying about deadlines felt like a triumph. Completing a restoration project under budget and receiving praise from a client reminded me that my work mattered. Even learning how to cook properly became a milestone. Sophie and I made it a weekly tradition to try new recipes, often ending in fits of laughter as we dealt with burned cookies or overly spicy sauces. "We'll get it right next time," I'd say, and Sophie would grin, her faith in me unwavering. As the months turned into years, life began to feel stable again. The gatehouse I had renovated became more than just a house. It became a home, filled with warmth, laughter, and memories. Sophie flourished in the steady environment, her confidence growing with each passing day. She made friends, excelled in school, and even started dreaming about her future. For me, the work of historical restoration continued to be both a profession and a passion. I took on larger projects, earning recognition for my dedication to preserving architectural history. The respect I gained from my peers felt different from the hollow ambition I once chased. It was grounded in authenticity and hard work. One evening, as Sophie and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, she leaned her head on my shoulder. "Do you think everything's better now?" she asked softly. I thought for a moment, the weight of her question settling over me. "It's not about better or worse," I said finally. "It's about making the best of what we have, and I think we're doing a pretty good job." Sophie smiled, content with my answer, and in that moment, I felt a deep sense of peace. The life I had rebuilt wasn't the one I had envisioned years ago, but it was one filled with meaning, growth, and love. As Sophie and I embraced our new normal, I realized that rebuilding wasn't just about recovering from loss. It was about creating something stronger. The lessons of the past had shaped us, but they didn't define us. The future was ours to write, and for the first time in a long while, I was ready to turn the page. The aftermath of the divorce hit Sarah harder than either of us had anticipated. At first, she seemed determined to hold her head high, maintaining the poised confidence that had once been her defining trait. But as the weight of her choices pressed down on her, that poise began to crack. The foreclosure on the house was the first tangible sign of her struggles. Despite her initial insistence that she could manage the mortgage, it quickly became clear that she couldn't keep up with the payments. The lavish McMansion she had fought so hard for was auctioned off within months of the divorce, leaving her to move into a modest one-bedroom apartment in a less desirable part of town. Financially, she was drowning. Between her student loans and the debts accumulated during our marriage, she was left with little room to breathe. Her credit cards, once a source of freedom, became an anchor. Bills piled up, and she was forced to confront a harsh reality. Her lifestyle was unsustainable. Compounding her financial woes was the fallout from her affair with Kane. The scandal had rippled through her professional life, tarnishing her reputation at the firm. Although she wasn't directly implicated in Kane's web of misconduct, her association with him made her a liability. The partners, eager to distance themselves from the controversy, suggested that she resign. It was a polite dismissal, but it shattered her confidence. Sarah, who had once been the rising star of her firm, was now an unemployed lawyer with a tarnished name. She took on contract work where she could find it, drafting documents and assisting smaller firms. But the pay was meager and the work unfulfilling. In the months that followed, Sarah reached out to me several times, her tone a mixture of regret and desperation. The first attempt came over the phone, late one evening, I was in the middle of reviewing blueprints for a restoration project when my phone buzzed. "Michael, can we talk?" she began, her voice unusually soft. I sighed, setting down the papers. "About what?" "About us," she said hesitantly. I've been thinking a lot, about everything. I know I made mistakes, but maybe we can try again. For Sophie's sake." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implications. For a moment, I considered the possibility. Rebuilding our family, giving Sophie the intact home she deserved. But then I remembered the months of secrecy, the lies, and the betrayal. I remembered how long I had spent trying to fix something Sarah had already given up on. "Sarah," I said finally, keeping my tone steady, "this isn't about Sophie. It's about you. And I can't go back. Not after everything." Her breath hitched on the other end, but she didn't argue. "I understand," she whispered, before hanging up. The second attempt came in person. Sarah showed up at my house unannounced one afternoon, looking far different from the woman I once knew. Her tailored suits had been replaced by casual clothes that hung loosely on her frame, and her once meticulously styled hair was tied back in a simple ponytail. She looked tired, worn down by the weight of her circumstances. "Michael," she said, standing in the doorway, "can we talk?" I hesitated, glancing back at Sophie, who was coloring at the kitchen table. "Sophie, why don't you take your book to your room for a little while?" I suggested gently. She nodded and scurried off, leaving us alone. Sarah stepped inside, her eyes scanning the house as if looking for traces of the life she had left behind. "I'm not here to argue," she began. I wanted to apologize. For everything. Her words caught me off guard. For so long I had resented her inability to take responsibility for what she had done. But now, standing before me, she seemed genuinely contrite. "I hurt you and I hurt Sophie," she continued, her voice trembling. "I was selfish, and I didn't see how much I was throwing away until it was too late." I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter. "Why now, Sarah? What do you want from me?" She shook her head. "Nothing. I don't want you to hate me." Her vulnerability was disarming, but it didn't change the facts. "I don't hate you," I said after a long pause. "But I can't forgive you either. Not yet. Maybe not ever." She nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. "I understand. I hope someday you'll see that I'm trying to be better." As Sarah left, I couldn't help but compare the paths we had taken since the divorce. While I had poured my energy into rebuilding, she seemed to be stuck, unable to fully move on. It wasn't just her financial struggles or her career setbacks. It was the sense that she hadn't yet figured out who she was without the life she had once built. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to see her as a villain. Sarah wasn't evil or malicious. She was human, flawed like the rest of us. She had made choices, and now she was living with the consequences. But those choices didn't define her entirely, just as my own didn't define me. As I watched her walk away, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Our chapter together was over, but it wasn't the end, for either of us. Sarah had her journey to navigate, and I had mine. And as I turned back to the house where Sophie was waiting, I knew exactly where my focus needed to be. Cain's downfall, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. It was inevitable. His tangled web of deceit unraveled as one scandal after another emerged, each one more damaging than the last. Clients accused him of professional misconduct. Former colleagues came forward with stories of his unethical behavior. The firm, eager to protect its reputation, severed ties and left him to face the fallout alone. I heard about his troubles through the grapevine, snippets of gossip and headlines that trickled into my world. The legal troubles were extensive, the lawsuits piling up like bricks in a wall he could no longer scale. His personal life didn't fare any better. His wife filed for divorce, taking their children and leaving him to grapple with the wreckage he had created. When the news reached me, I wanted to nigh feeling a small sense of vindication. Cain, who had so cavalierly disrupted my life, was now facing the consequences of his actions. But that feeling was fleeting. The truth was, I had already moved past him. Cain wasn't the center of my story. He was just a painful chapter. People often expect revenge to bring satisfaction, but I had learned that it rarely does. I didn't need to see Cain suffer to find peace. His downfall was a result of his own choices, and that was justice enough. My focus wasn't on him anymore. It was on the life I was rebuilding, the daughter I was raising, and the future I was creating. Work continued to bring me a sense of purpose. Every historical restoration project I completed felt like a small victory, not just for the craft, but for me personally. I had found a career that didn't just pay the bills, but fed my soul. The meticulous care required to restore beauty from decay mirrored my own journey of growth and healing. Sophie remained my anchor, her laughter and curiosity lighting up even my darkest days. Together, we built routines that were simple but meaningful. Weekend breakfasts at the local diner, afternoon bike rides, evenings spent reading stories before bed. Watching her grow and thrive reminded me that life didn't have to be perfect to be beautiful. One sunny afternoon, as we worked together in the garden outside our home, she turned to me and asked, "Do you think we're happy, Dad?" I paused, surprised by her question, then smiled. "I think we are, Sophie. What about you?" She grinned, wiping dirt from her hands. "Yeah, we are." In that moment, I realized just how far we had come. The hurt, the betrayal, the chaos, they were part of the past now, lessons learned and left behind. Not to mention debt we took, and our wild, exhilarating leisure. Looking back, I saw the arc of my journey clearly. What began as a story of love and loss had become one of resilience and growth. The betrayal that once consumed me had faded into a distant memory, replaced by gratitude for the strength I had found in its aftermath. I wasn't the same person I had been at the start of this story, and that was a good thing. The experience had shaped me, forcing me to confront my own flaws and rebuild on a stronger foundation. I learned to find joy in the small moments, to appreciate the people who stood by me, and to focus on what truly mattered. As the sun set on the garden that day, Sophie ran inside to grab lemonade, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I looked around at the life I had created, the thriving business, the cozy home, the happy daughter, and felt a profound sense of contentment. The past would always be there, a shadow at the edges of my memory, but it no longer defined me. I had turned the page, and the next chapter was mine to write. And for the first time in years, I was genuinely excited to see what came next. As I look back on the twists and turns of the past few years, I see not just the pain and betrayal, but the resilience and growth that followed. Life has a way of dismantling the plans we so carefully construct, forcing us to face what we're made of. In my case, it stripped away the illusions of stability and love I had built my world around. But in the ashes of that collapse, I found something unexpected: clarity. Betrayal has a way of revealing the strength you didn't know you had. It forces you to confront not just the actions of others, but your own values and choices. For me, the journey wasn't just about overcoming what Sarah and Cain had done. It was about learning to stand firmly in my own integrity. I realized that material success, while comforting, isn't the measure of a fulfilling life. The sprawling house, the carefully curated image, they were meaningless without genuine connection. What truly mattered were the relationships built on trust, the work driven by purpose, and the moments shared with the people who matter most. Through the process of rebuilding, I discovered a life that was simpler but far richer. The business I now run isn't just a job. It's a passion that aligns with my values. Sophie, my greatest joy, reminds me daily of the importance of being present, of nurturing love and stability. Together, we've created a home filled not with extravagance, but with warmth and laughter. Growth isn't linear. It's messy, uncomfortable, and often comes with more questions than answers. But it's also deeply rewarding. I've learned to forgive, not for others, but for myself. I've let go of anger and resentment, replacing them with gratitude for the lessons learned. The past, as painful as it was, shaped me into the person I am today. Most importantly, I've learned the value of hope. Even in the darkest moments, there's always the potential for light. Betrayal, loss, and failure are not the end. They're the beginning of something new, something stronger. It's not about avoiding pain. It's about using it to grow. As I sit here now, watching Sophie play in the backyard, the evening sunlight casting golden hues over the garden, I feel a profound sense of peace. The road wasn't easy, but it led me here, to a life I can truly call my own. To anyone facing their own storms, I'll leave you with this. Life will break you. But if you let it, life will also rebuild you. Trust in the process, hold on to your integrity, and never stop believing in the possibility of something better. Because the best chapters are always the ones we haven't written yet.